They waited until dinner to tell me. Not a conversation in private. Not a warning. Dinner with the table fully set, the candles lit, the smell of roasted chicken thick in the air like comfort, pretending to be kindness. My name is Hannah Cole. I was 32 years old that night, sitting at my parents-in-law's dining table in a quiet suburb outside Hartford, Connecticut, believing I was safe because family dinners were supposed to be safe. I had been married to their son for 5 years. 5 years of holidays, thank you notes, careful smiles, and learning when to speak and when to stay quiet. I thought I had earned my place. I was wrong. My mother-in-law Judith had cooked. She always did. Cooking was her way of holding power without looking like she was holding anything at all. My father-in-law Richard poured the wine himself, measured and deliberate like a man who believed control should be subtle. My husband Daniel sat beside me, his knee touching mine under the table, his hand resting near my plate, but not quite reaching for me. His younger brother Stephen was there too, relaxed, confident, already at home in a way I never quite was. We talked about ordinary things at first: weather, traffic, a neighbor's new fence. I laughed at the right moments. I complimented the food. I asked questions. I did everything a good daughter-in-law was supposed to do. But there was a tension I couldn't name, something stiff in the air like the quiet before a storm that everyone else seems prepared for, except you. Halfway through the meal, Judith set her fork down. The sound was soft, but it cut through the room. Richard cleared his throat. Daniel stopped chewing. Stephen leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, already detached. Hannah, Judith said, smiling the way she did when she wanted to sound gentle, but wasn't feeling it. We think it's time to have an honest conversation. Honest. That word landed heavy in my chest. I nodded, my stomach tightening. Of course. Richard folded his napkin carefully, placing it beside his plate. This is about the family, he said. About the future. Daniel stared at his food. He didn't look at me, not once. We've been reviewing our estate plans, Judith continued. The will, the trust, the business assets. I felt my pulse in my ears. I waited for reassurance. Something like this is just paperwork, or you're part of the family, or nothing changes. None of that came. It's important to us, Richard said, that there is no misunderstanding. Judith met my eyes. Her gaze was steady, almost relieved. You will not be receiving anything from this family. The words didn't register at first. They hovered between us, unreal, like a sentence spoken in the wrong language. I'm sorry, I said. I don't think I understand. You won't inherit anything, she clarified. Not property, not money, not business interests. Nothing now, nothing later. Stephen smiled faintly, the corner of his mouth lifting as if this were a detail he already knew and found mildly amusing. This isn't personal, Richard said. It's about bloodline, about keeping things clean. Clean, as if I were something that might stain. I turned to Daniel. Is this true? He swallowed. Yes. That single word felt heavier than anything his parents had said. You knew, I whispered. He didn't answer. Judith reached for her wine glass. We wanted to tell you directly. Transparency matters to us. My hands were shaking, so I folded them together under the table, pressing my nails into my skin to stay present. I thought about every holiday I had hosted, every compromise I had made, every time I had defended Daniel to my own family. Every assumption I had carried quietly, like the belief that loyalty worked both ways. So if something happens to you, I said, my voice steady, only because I forced it to be, I get nothing. That's correct, Richard said. And to be clear, this applies regardless of your marriage. I waited for Daniel to say something, anything. He stayed silent. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. I don't remember the taste of the food. I don't remember what was said after that. I remember the sound of cutlery, the ticking clock on the wall, the way Judith asked if I wanted dessert, as if she hadn't just erased me from the future she was planning. When we left, I thanked them. I don't know why. Habit, maybe. Or shock. The drive home was quiet. Daniel gripped the steering wheel, eyes forward, jaw tight. They didn't mean it the way it sounded, he said eventually. I think they meant exactly what they said, I replied. That night, lying awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, something inside me changed. It wasn't rage. Not yet. It was understanding. A cold, clarifying realization that I had been living inside a story that wasn't written for me. They had drawn a line, very clearly. And for the first time since I married into that family, I stopped trying to cross it. Because if they had decided I would get nothing, then I had nothing left to lose. I didn't sleep that night. Daniel fell asleep almost immediately, his breathing slow and even beside me, like the conversation at his parents' table had been a minor inconvenience instead of a fracture. I lay on my back, staring into the dark, replaying every word, every pause, every moment he could have spoken and chose not to. The ceiling fan turned slowly above us, a soft, mechanical rhythm that felt mocking in its normalcy. This was my marriage. This was the family I had worked so hard to fit into. And they had just told me plainly that I would never truly belong. In the morning, Daniel acted as if nothing had happened. He kissed my cheek before work, asked if I wanted coffee, reminded me that the plumber was coming later. Ordinary gestures layered over something rotten. I watched him from the kitchen doorway, noticing details I had ignored before. The way he avoided my eyes, the way his shoulders tensed when I didn't respond right away. He knew. He had always known. And he had decided it was easier to let me be blindsided than to challenge his parents. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, my untouched coffee growing cold. I thought about my own parents, retired teachers, in a small town in Pennsylvania. People who believed marriage meant partnership. They had raised me to contribute to compromise, to assume fairness, even when it wasn't obvious. I wondered what they would say if they knew that my in-laws had just announced my exclusion like a business decision. I didn't call them. I wasn't ready to explain something I hadn't fully accepted myself. Instead, I cleaned. I wiped down counters that were already clean. I reorganized drawers. I needed movement, something to ground me. When I ran out of tasks, I opened the filing cabinet in our home office. I told myself I was just looking for distraction for paperwork that needed attention. That was a lie. Something inside me was already searching. Most of the folders were familiar. Insurance, taxes, utilities. Then I saw one I didn't recognize, tucked behind a row of old manuals. Thick, heavy, labeled in Daniel's handwriting, Cole Holdings. My heart began to race. I hesitated, my hand hovering for a moment before pulling it free. The folder contained documents I had never seen. Legal language dense and deliberate. Trust agreements, ownership charts, amendments dated months back. As I flipped through the pages, a pattern emerged, one that made my stomach drop. Assets were being shifted. Slowly, quietly. Moved out of joint structures and into entities that bore Daniel's name alone, or worse, his brother's. There was a clause I read 3 times to be sure I understood it. In the event of divorce, I would be entitled only to what I personally brought into the marriage. No appreciation, no shared gains, no consideration for contributions that weren't easily quantified. It was airtight, designed that way. I closed the folder and sat back in the chair, my hands trembling. So that was it. The dinner hadn't been a beginning. It had been a courtesy. They had already decided my future without me. And Daniel had gone along with it. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Judith. Thank you again for last night. These conversations are never easy, but clarity is a gift. I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. Clarity. She was right about that, at least. I had never seen things more clearly in my life. When Daniel came home, I said nothing. I cooked dinner. I asked about his day. I smiled when appropriate. He relaxed, visibly relief softening his posture. He thought the storm had passed, that I had accepted my place quietly, like I always did. Over the next few weeks, I began to notice things I couldn't unsee. Emails from our accountant that no longer included me. Calendar events labeled vaguely meetings Daniel said were work-related, but took place at his parents' office. Small transfers from our joint account into accounts I couldn't access, amounts framed as temporary as insignificant. I started keeping notes, dates, times, screenshots. I told myself it was just for understanding. That was another lie. One evening, while folding laundry, I asked casually, "Have you ever thought about what would happen if something happened to you?" Daniel stiffened. "What kind of question is that?" "Just thinking about the future," I said lightly. "Planning." He shrugged. "Everything's handled." "Handled how?" "You don't need to worry about it." There it was again. That gentle dismissal, that assumption that I would stop asking. I smiled and let it drop, but inside something hardened. Worry was no longer the right word. I wasn't anxious. I was alert. A few days later, during lunch at work, I called a lawyer. Her name was Rebecca Lynn. I found her through a colleague who described her as thorough and discreet. When I sat across from her in a quiet office downtown, sunlight spilling across the desk, I told her everything. The dinner, the documents, the transfers, Daniel's silence. She listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she folded her hands. "You're not imagining this," she said, "and you're not powerless, but you need to move carefully." She explained marital asset laws in terms that made my chest tighten and then ease. What mattered, what didn't, what timing could change, what documentation could protect me. And one more thing she added, "If they think you know too much, they'll accelerate their plans." I nodded. I had already learned how much happened in the dark. As I left her office, stepping back into the noise of the street, I felt something unfamiliar settle over me. Not fear, not even anger. Resolve. They had told me I would get nothing. They believed that was the end of the story. It wasn't. It was the beginning. Once you stop believing the story you were given, you start seeing the seams, the weak stitches, the places where the truth has been patched over so many times it can't hold anymore. That was what happened to me after that dinner. I didn't confront. I didn't accuse. I observed. I listened. And I learned just how long this betrayal had been in motion. Daniel became predictable once I knew what to watch for. The way his voice shifted when he talked about money. The sudden late meetings that always seemed to fall on the same nights each month. The careful way he framed questions not to include me, but to measure how much I knew. I answered lightly, vaguely, playing the role he expected. The agreeable wife. The one who trusted him. The one who didn't need to be involved. Inside, I was building something else entirely. It started with the business. Cole Holdings wasn't just a name on paper. It was the shell through which his family controlled several small manufacturing contracts in the Northeast. Daniel had once spoken proudly about expanding it, about modernizing operations, about how one day it would all be his responsibility. I had supported him, proofread proposals, listened to endless late-night conversations about margins and logistics. None of that counted now. On paper, I was a bystander. One evening while Daniel showered, his phone lit up on the nightstand. I hadn't planned to look. I told myself I wouldn't. But the screen was bright, the name visible. Stephen. And beneath it a preview that made my breath catch. "We need to move the timeline up. Mom's worried." I didn't touch the phone. I didn't need to. The words burned themselves into my memory. Timeline, move it up, worried. That night, Daniel was restless. He turned in his sleep, muttering once, something about documents. I lay awake beside him, staring into the darkness, piecing things together. The dinner hadn't been a warning for me. It had been a checkpoint for them. A moment to confirm I was still in the dark. The next day, I took a personal day from work and went somewhere I hadn't been in years. The Public Records Office. It was quiet, almost empty, the kind of place people forget exists until they need it. I searched property records tied to the Cole name, cross-referenced business filings, traced changes in ownership. It took hours. By the time I left, my head ached, but the picture was clear. Assets were being transferred not just to exclude me, but to insulate Daniel in the event of divorce or dispute. They were preparing for something, or someone. At home, I opened my own accounts. Quietly, I rerouted my paycheck. I began separating what was mine without announcing it. I updated passwords. I changed security questions. These weren't acts of revenge. They were acts of survival. Judith called that weekend, her voice syrupy. "We're thinking of hosting Thanksgiving this year," she said. "It would be nice to have everyone together." I pictured that dining room table, the candles, the roast, the way she smiled when she took something away. "Of course," I said. "That sounds lovely." After I hung up, I laughed, not out loud, inside, a short, bitter sound. Thanksgiving was about inheritance, about legacy, about who belonged at the table. They didn't realize how fitting that invitation was. A few days later, Daniel asked me casually if I was happy. The question came out of nowhere over takeout containers and a muted television. I looked at him, really looked at him, and wondered when he had stopped being someone I trusted and become someone I needed to protect myself from. "I'm fine," I said. "Why?" "No reason," he replied too quickly. "Just checking." He was checking to see if I was still asleep. That night, I called Rebecca again. I told her about the documents, the transfers, the message from Stephen. Her tone sharpened. "They're preparing to finalize something," she said, "and you're right to stay quiet. For now." "For now," I repeated. "There's another angle we should consider," she continued. "Leverage." The word sat between us, heavy with possibility. She explained that while I might be excluded from their plans, they had made a critical mistake. They had underestimated my access, my knowledge, my patience. There were ways to document contributions that went beyond money, ways to establish patterns, intent. "Revenge doesn't have to be loud," she said. Sometimes it's just letting people walk into the consequences of their own decisions. When I hung up, I sat alone in the dark living room. The house felt different now. Smaller, less like a home, and more like a stage set I had been performing on. I thought about the woman I had been when I married Daniel. Hopeful, earnest, willing to bend. That woman was gone. They had told me I would get nothing from their family, no inheritance, no protection, no future stake. What they hadn't realized was that by excluding me, they had freed me. I was no longer bound by the need to be liked to be chosen to be included. I was done waiting for permission, and the longer they believed I was powerless, the more powerful I became. Power changes shape when you stop asking for it. It becomes quieter, more deliberate. That was the phase I entered next. On the surface, nothing changed. I still attended family dinners. I still smiled at Judith's comments and laughed at Stephen's jokes. I still played the role of the agreeable wife who didn't ask difficult questions. But underneath that performance, I was moving carefully, placing pieces where they needed to be waiting. Thanksgiving came early that year. Judith insisted on hosting, framing it as tradition, as togetherness. Daniel seemed relieved. He liked things that looked normal. I arrived with a homemade pie just like every year, my hands steady, my voice warm. If they expected tension, they didn't see it on me. The house was full. Extended family. Laughter. The long table once again crowded with dishes and expectations. At some point during the afternoon, I realized something important. They weren't watching me. They thought the dinner months ago had settled everything. To them, I was a known variable, a non-issue. That kind of arrogance leaves doors unlocked. After dessert, Richard asked Daniel and Stephen to join him in the study. Business talk, he said, waving it off as boring. Judith stayed in the kitchen with me, wiping counters that were already clean. She talked about recipes, about neighbors, about how nice it was that things felt peaceful again. I nodded, adding polite sounds where required. "Marriage works best when everyone knows their place," she said casually, not looking at me. "Yes," I replied, "it does." Later that night, after we got home, Daniel was unusually quiet. He poured himself a drink and stared out the window. "They're getting older," he said. "There's a lot to manage." "I'm sure," I said. He glanced at me, searching my face. "You're being very understanding." I met his eyes. I've had time to think. That was true, just not in the way he assumed. A week later, something unexpected happened. I received an email from a woman named Margaret Cole, Daniel's grandmother. She lived in assisted living in upstate New York and had always been described as distant, frail, uninvolved. The email was brief. "Hannah, I would like to see you, alone, if you're willing." I read it 3 times. Daniel had never mentioned she had an email address. I didn't tell him. Instead, I took a day off work and drove north. The landscape shifting from familiar suburbs to quiet stretches of road lined with bare trees. The facility was clean, understated, expensive. Margaret sat by a window wrapped in a soft shawl, her eyes sharp despite her age. "You look thinner," she said as I approached. "They always forget to feed the women properly." I smiled, unsure what to say. "Sit," she instructed. "I don't have much time, and I don't enjoy wasting it." She wasted no time. "I know what my son and daughter-in-law told you," she said. "About getting nothing." My heart pounded. They wanted to be honest. She snorted. "They wanted to be cruel and call it honesty." I didn't interrupt. "They think I don't pay attention," she continued. "They think because I'm old, I've handed everything over, that I don't see the way they move things around, the way they plan." I swallowed. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're the only one who didn't assume I was useless," she said. "You were the only one who ever asked me questions, who listened." She reached for a folder beside her chair and handed it to me. "I want you to read this. Not here. At home." I hesitated. "Daniel doesn't know I'm here." "Good," she said. "Let's keep it that way." The drive back felt unreal. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. When I finally opened the folder at home alone, my breath caught. It contained older versions of the family will, notes, amendments never finalized, and one handwritten letter. In it, Margaret outlined her disappointment, the favoritism, the manipulation, the way Richard and Judith had reshaped the family business for control, not legacy. She wrote about fairness, about partnership, about how inheritance should reflect character, not blood alone. At the end, a sentence stood out. "If I decide to revise things again, I want someone who understands what they're protecting." I sat on the floor for a long time, the papers spread around me. This was the leverage Rebecca had hinted at. Not money yet, not revenge. Influence. That night, Daniel told me his parents were considering accelerating some legal changes, just in case he said. I nodded. That makes sense. Inside, I was already 3 steps ahead, because while they were busy locking me out, they hadn't realized someone else had quietly opened a window. And for the first time since that dinner, I felt something close to calm. They thought they had written me out of the story. They were wrong. They had only delayed the chapter where everything turns. From the outside, nothing changed. That was the most dangerous part. Daniel still kissed me goodbye in the mornings. Judith still sent polite texts. Stephen still treated me like background noise. And I let them. I learned quickly that invisibility, when chosen, is a weapon. People speak freely around someone they believe has no power. They make plans. They reveal intentions. They forget to lock doors. I began seeing Margaret regularly. Always quietly. Always without Daniel's knowledge. We spoke about ordinary things at first. Her childhood, the early days of the family business, the mistakes she believed she had made by trusting her son too much and asking too few questions. Over time, the conversations sharpened. She asked about my work, my finances, my marriage. She listened closely, asking follow-up questions that told me she was still far sharper than anyone gave her credit for. One afternoon, as snow dusted the grounds outside her window, she said, "They told you you'd get nothing because they believe fear keeps people small." I didn't answer. "They assume you'll cling," she continued, "that you'll try harder, that you'll accept less." I met her eyes. "They're wrong." A slow smile spread across her face. "Good." Meanwhile, at home, the pressure began to shift. Daniel grew tense, short-tempered. He started asking questions he hadn't asked before. Whether I was happy at work, whether I planned to stay long-term, whether I'd thought about children again. It felt less like curiosity and more like assessment, as if he were trying to calculate risk. One night over dinner he said, "My parents think it might be smart for us to revisit the prenup." I set my fork down carefully. "Revisit how?" "Just clarify a few things," he said quickly. "Standard stuff." "I see," I replied. "You're very calm," he said. "I've learned the value of clarity," I answered. He watched me for a long moment, suspicion flickering across his face before he masked it. He didn't know that I had already updated my own legal protections, that I had documented years of financial contribution, that Rebecca had helped me prepare for exactly this moment. A week later, Margaret asked me to bring Rebecca to visit her. "I want someone competent in the room," she said, "and loyal." That meeting changed everything. Margaret spoke plainly about her intentions, about her disappointment, about her desire to revise what still remained under her control. Rebecca listened careful and precise, asking questions that mattered. When we left, Rebecca turned to me in the parking lot. "They underestimated you," she said, "and they underestimated her." Back home, the atmosphere thickened. Judith began calling more often, her tone falsely warm. Stephen made jokes that landed sharper. Daniel became distant, then overly attentive, swinging between guilt and calculation. I realized then that they sensed movement even if they couldn't see its source. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Daniel asked me to sit down. His hands shook slightly as he spoke. "My parents are concerned," he said. "They think you've been distant." I smiled. "That's interesting." "They want reassurance," he continued, "that you're not planning anything." I leaned back in my chair. "Planning what?" "A divorce," he said finally. There it was, the word they had been preparing for all along. "I haven't decided anything," I said truthfully. He exhaled in relief. "Too much relief." "Good," he said, "because that would complicate things." For who, I asked. He didn't answer. That night, lying beside him, I felt nothing. No anger, no sorrow, just distance. I understood then that my marriage had already ended. What remained was logistics. The next morning, I received a call from Margaret's facility. She had been taken to the hospital overnight. Nothing life-threatening, they said, but serious enough that she wanted to see me immediately. I arrived to find Judith already there, her posture rigid, her eyes sharp with suspicion when she saw me. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "Margaret asked for me," I replied calmly. Margaret reached for my hand. "She stays," she said firmly. "You can wait outside." Judith's face tightened, but she complied. Alone. Margaret squeezed my hand. They're moving faster now, she said. So am I. She handed me a sealed envelope. If anything happens to me, she said, this goes to Rebecca. Understand? I knotted my throat tight. As I left the hospital that day, the weight of what was unfolding settled fully on my shoulders. This was no longer about exclusion or revenge alone. It was about truth, about legacy, about what happens when people mistake kindness for weakness. They had told me I would get nothing from their family. They were about to learn the cost of that assumption. The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and old flowers. Margaret lay propped against white pillows, smaller than she had looked in her apartment, but her eyes were still sharp, tracking every movement, every sound in the hallway. Judith had left reluctantly, her heels clicking away like punctuation marks at the end of an argument she hadn't won. I sat beside the bed, holding Margaret's hand, feeling the surprising strength still there beneath the thin skin. They're frightened, Margaret said quietly. That's why they're clumsy now. I didn't ask who she meant. You should rest, I said. She waved the idea away. I didn't ask you here to sleep. She spoke slowly, choosing her words with care. She told me about the early years of the business, about how she and her husband had built it from nothing, how survival had required trust, and how that trust had eroded over time. She talked about Richard's hunger for control, Judith's talent for manipulation, Stephen's entitlement, and Daniel. She paused longest when she spoke his name. He learned early that silence was rewarded, she said, that letting others decide kept him safe. I felt something twist inside my chest. Not sympathy, recognition. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. I am revising what I still can, she said. But I need someone outside their influence, someone who won't be bullied once I'm gone. You have lawyers, I said carefully. I have lawyers who answer to my son, she replied. I need someone who understands what it means to be excluded. That word again. Excluded. It sounded different now, less like a wound, more like a qualification. When I left the hospital, I didn't go home. I drove instead aimlessly at first, then with purpose ending up parked along a quiet street overlooking the river. I sat there for a long time, engine-off phone in my lap. Daniel had texted twice. Where are you? Everything okay? I didn't respond. That evening I met Rebecca at her office. I told her everything Margaret had said, everything she planned to do. Rebecca listened, her expression thoughtful. This puts you in a complicated position, she said, legally and personally. I'm already in a complicated position, I replied. Rebecca nodded. Then here's what matters. Documentation, witnesses, and timing. If Margaret moves forward, there will be backlash. I expect it, I said. Backlash came sooner than expected. The next morning, Judith called me. Her voice was tight, polite in the way people get when they are trying not to show anger. Daniel tells me you were at the hospital. Yes, I said. She's fragile, Judith continued. This isn't the time for confusion. I was invited, I replied. A pause. Then you need to remember your place in this family. I almost laughed. Almost. My place, I said calmly, is wherever I'm asked to be. She hung up without another word. That night, Daniel confronted me. He stood in the doorway of our bedroom, arms crossed, eyes wary. What's going on with you and my grandmother? She asked to see me, I said. Why? You'd have to ask her. He exhaled sharply. My parents think you're manipulating her. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw fear underneath the accusation. Do you think that I asked? He didn't answer. I've spent years supporting you, I continued, staying quiet, making things easier. And now that I'm finally being honest about where I stand, you're uncomfortable. This isn't about honesty, he said. It's about loyalty. Yes, I replied. It is. He slept on the couch that night, or pretended to. I lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the house, feeling the last threads of attachment loosen. Marriage, I realized, doesn't always end with shouting or betrayal in the obvious sense. Sometimes it ends with clarity, with the understanding that the person beside you will never stand up for you when it matters most. 2 days later, Margaret was discharged. Judith insisted on bringing her home. Margaret insisted on seeing me first. In the quiet of her apartment, she handed me a new folder. "These are copies," she said. Safeguards. I opened it later alone, my hands steady. Updated directives. Letters. Notes outlining her intentions in unmistakable language. Not finalized yet, but close. Very close. At home, Daniel barely spoke to me. Stephen stopped returning my greetings entirely. The family had closed ranks. I felt it in the silence, in the way information dried up, in the sudden politeness that replaced casual cruelty. They were preparing. So was I. I updated my personal accounts again. I moved essential documents to a secure location. I made contingency plans, not because I was planning to strike, but because I knew one truth above all others now. People who fear losing control often make reckless decisions. Late one evening, as I was packing a small box of personal items, Daniel appeared behind me. "Are you leaving?" he asked. "I'm organizing," I said. "For what?" "For whatever comes next." He looked at me like a stranger. Maybe I was one now. Or maybe I had always been, and he was only just noticing. That night I dreamed of that first dinner again. The candles, the chicken, the calm voices explaining my exclusion as if it were a kindness. In the dream, I stood up from the table. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I simply walked away, leaving them staring at the empty chair I no longer needed. When I woke, I knew the next phase was coming. The part where secrets stop being private, where intentions collide, where people who believed they had all the power discover how fragile it really is. By the time people realize they are losing control, they rarely admit it. They tighten their grip instead. They rewrite narratives. They look for someone to blame. That was the stage Daniel's family entered next. And once you recognize it, the pattern is impossible to ignore. It began with concern, or at least that was how Judith framed it. She called me on a Wednesday morning, her voice soft, careful, almost maternal. "I've been worried about you," she said. "You seem overwhelmed, distracted. We all go through phases like that." "I'm fine," I replied. "Of course you are," she said quickly. "But stress can make people act out of character." Act out. The phrase lodged itself in my mind. That afternoon, Daniel told me his parents had suggested counseling. Not for us, for me. They thought I might be struggling emotionally, processing the inheritance conversation poorly. He said it gently, as if repeating something reasonable. "They're trying to help," he said. "They're trying to control the story," I replied. He flinched. "Why are you being so combative?" "I'm being accurate," I said. A few days later, I noticed a charge on our joint account I didn't recognize. Small enough to be overlooked. A consultation fee. When I asked Daniel about it, he said his parents had recommended a financial planner to help us align our goals. "Did you meet with them?" I asked. "No," he said. "Not yet." Another lie. I felt it immediately. I called Rebecca that night. "They're creating a record," she said after I explained. "Concern, instability. If this turns adversarial, they want to paint you as unreasonable." "I've done nothing unreasonable," I said. "That's not the point," she replied. "Perception is." So I adjusted. I became even calmer, kinder. I responded to texts promptly. I thanked Judith for her concern. I agreed to meet the financial planner. I smiled through it all, documenting every interaction quietly, thoroughly. The planner was connected to Richard. Of course he was. He asked questions that felt less like planning and more like assessment. Did I feel secure? Did I trust my husband? Did I worry about the future? I answered honestly but carefully. No emotion, no accusation, just facts. When I left, I sent Rebecca a summary. The pressure escalated when Margaret fell ill again. Not hospitalized, but enough that decisions had to be made. Judith and Richard moved quickly, inserting themselves, limiting access. When I asked to visit, Judith said Margaret was resting. When Margaret called me directly, Judith accused me of upsetting her. "You're causing unnecessary stress," she said sharply. "This isn't about you." "It never is," I replied. That night, Daniel told me his parents were considering power of attorney adjustments. "Temporary," he said, "just in case." Just in case of what I asked. He didn't answer. I realized then what they were trying to do. They weren't just excluding me anymore. They were trying to erase Margaret's agency, to step in fully legally before she could finalize anything. It was a race, and they were willing to push her aside to win it. I drove to Margaret's apartment the next morning without telling anyone. She looked tired, but when she saw me, her eyes brightened. "They think I'm finished," she said. "I'm not." She told me Judith had pressured her to sign documents she hadn't fully read, that Richard had spoken over her, dismissed her concerns, that Stephen had joked about simplifying things before they got messy. "I want witnesses," Margaret said. "I want this done properly." I called Rebecca from the hallway. She arrived that afternoon with a second attorney and a notary. The atmosphere in the apartment shifted instantly. Professional, formal, unignorable. Margaret spoke clearly, decisively. She refused to sign anything she hadn't requested herself. She instructed them to proceed with her revisions. Judith arrived halfway through, furious. "What is this?" she demanded. "Due process," Rebecca said calmly. Judith turned to me, her face hard. "You've turned her against us!" Margaret laughed. "No, Hannah didn't turn me against you. You did that all on your own." The silence that followed was thick, electric. Afterward, as Rebecca packed her files, she leaned toward me. "That was smart," she said. "They overplayed their hand." At home, Daniel was waiting. His face was pale. "My parents are livid," he said. "They think you're orchestrating this." "I didn't orchestrate anything," I replied. "I showed up when I was asked." "This is tearing the family apart," he said. "No," I answered. "It's revealing it." That was the night he finally said it. "If this continues," he said quietly, "we may not survive it." I looked at him, at the man I had married, at the boy who had learned silence as survival. "We already didn't," I said. He slept on the couch again. This time I didn't mind. The next morning, Margaret called me early. Her voice was steady, resolute. "It's time," she said. "They will fight. You need to be ready." I was ready, because when people who rely on manipulation lose their grip, they don't retreat gracefully. They expose themselves. And once exposed, there is no going back. The first letter arrived on a Monday morning. Heavy paper, legal language, the kind of envelope that makes your chest tighten before you even open it. It was addressed to me directly, not to Daniel, not to us. That alone told me everything I needed to know. They had decided to stop pretending. I read it at the kitchen table, sunlight slanting across the floor, the house silent except for the ticking clock. Richard and Judith were formally requesting that I cease all involvement in Margaret's personal affairs. They cited concern, undue influence, emotional manipulation. The phrases were carefully chosen sharp without sounding aggressive. It was the opening move of a strategy meant to intimidate. I forwarded it to Rebecca without comment. Her response came quickly. Expected. Do not reply directly. Daniel found out that evening. He stood in the doorway holding his phone, his face drawn. "My parents are furious," he said. "They're talking about lawyers." "They already are," I replied. "You don't understand," he said. "They'll destroy you if this goes to court." I looked at him calmly. "You mean they'll try?" That was the moment he truly saw me. Not as his wife, not as the woman who smoothed things over, as an adversary. His expression shifted, something like fear flickering behind his eyes. Over the next weeks, the pressure came from all sides. Friends of the family stopped inviting us to gatherings. Stephen made pointed comments about loyalty on social media. Judith left a voicemail telling me I was poisoning Margaret against her own son. I saved everything. Dates, times, words. Margaret, meanwhile, grew stronger in her resolve. She dictated letters. She reviewed documents line by line. She insisted on independent medical evaluations to counter any claims of incapacity. Every move was deliberate, every step documented. One afternoon, as we sat together, she looked at me and said, "They never thought I would choose you." "I never expected you to," I replied honestly. She smiled. "That's why I did." The revised will was signed 2 weeks later. Quietly, legally, properly. It didn't make me wealthy overnight. That was never Margaret's goal. But it changed the balance. It named me as a trustee, a safeguard, someone with authority to oversee distributions and decisions related to a significant portion of the estate. When Judith found out, she didn't call. She came to the house. I opened the door to find her standing there, rigid, her face tight with fury she was barely containing. "How dare you?" she said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Come in," I replied calmly. She didn't sit. "You manipulated an old woman," she said. "You exploited her." I listened to her, I said. "There's a difference." "You were never meant to be part of this family," she snapped. "That's true," I replied. "You made that very clear." She stared at me, realizing too late that her earlier declaration had become my armor. "This will destroy Daniel," she said, her voice breaking just slightly. I thought of the years I had protected him, the silence I had kept, the compromises I had made. "Daniel made his choices," I said. "So did you." She left without another word. That night, Daniel packed a bag. "I need space," he said. "I understand," I replied. He paused, looking around the house as if seeing it for the first time. "You planned this," he said quietly. "No," I answered. "I survived it." When the door closed behind him, the house felt strangely peaceful. Empty, but peaceful. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing for the next dismissal, the next reminder of my place. A week later, the final blow came. Margaret passed away in her sleep. Peacefully, they said. I cried, genuinely. For her, for the woman who had seen me when others refused to. The funeral was tense, controlled, polite on the surface. I sat alone, aware of every glance, every whisper. When the attorney announced that the will would be read privately at a later date, Judith's jaw tightened. She knew. They all did. In the days that followed, I received messages from people who had once ignored me. Curious, cautious, testing the waters. I didn't respond. Because this was no longer about them, or even about revenge. It was about consequence. They had told me at that dinner that I would get nothing from their family. They believed exclusion would keep me small, dependent, silent. Instead, it taught me exactly how much power I had been giving away. And now that power was mine to hold. The reading of the will was scheduled for a rainy Thursday morning, the kind of day that presses everything inward, forcing people to sit with their thoughts. The law office was old quiet, all dark wood and restrained authority. I arrived early, not because I was eager, but because I refused to arrive flustered. Judith and Richard were already there when I stepped inside, seated stiffly side by side. Stephen leaned against the wall, scrolling on his phone, pretending indifference. Daniel arrived last. He avoided my eyes. No one spoke to me. That was fine. Silence no longer felt like punishment. It felt like confirmation. The attorney began with formalities. Names, dates, legal language that sounded detached, almost gentle. Then the substance. Margaret's voice echoed through the words she had chosen so carefully. Gratitude for those who had respected her autonomy, disappointment in those who had not. A clear, unmistakable assertion of her intent. When my name was read, Judith inhaled sharply. Richard's jaw tightened. Stephen stopped scrolling. I was named trustee over a significant portion of the estate. Oversight authority, veto power on certain decisions, safeguards designed specifically to prevent unilateral control. It wasn't everything. Margaret hadn't been vindictive. She had been precise. Judith stood abruptly. This is outrageous, she said. She was manipulated. The attorney didn't look up. All evaluations confirm capacity, he said calmly. The documentation is thorough. Richard spoke next, his voice low and dangerous. This will be contested. You're within your rights, the attorney replied. Daniel said nothing. He stared at the table, his knuckles white. When it was over, people filed out slowly. Judith brushed past me without a word. Stephen laughed once, sharp and humorless. Richard paused, his eyes cold. Enjoy your victory, he said. It won't last. I met his gaze. It's not a victory, I said. It's an outcome. Outside, the rain had stopped. The air felt cleaner, lighter. I stood there for a moment, breathing it in. That evening, Daniel came to the house to collect more of his things. He moved quietly, methodically, as if trying not to disturb something fragile. They're going to fight this, he said without looking at me. I know, I replied. You didn't have to do this, he said finally. You could have walked away. I turned to him. I did walk away, from being erased. He nodded slowly. I don't recognize you. I don't think you ever really saw me, I said. The legal battle was ugly, predictable. Accusations, motions, delays. Judith claimed undue influence. Richard questioned Margaret's mental state. Stephen leaked selective narratives to anyone who would listen. But facts have weight. Documentation has gravity. And truth, once recorded, is difficult to bury. Weeks turned into months. I attended meetings, reviewed decisions, exercised my authority sparingly but firmly. Each time I did, the resistance softened slightly. Not because they agreed, but because they realized I wasn't going anywhere. One afternoon, Rebecca called me with news. They want to settle, she said. I wasn't surprised. The cost, financial and reputational, had begun to outweigh their pride. The settlement didn't give them everything they wanted. It didn't give me everything I could have taken. It gave everyone exactly what they deserved. When it was finalized, I sat alone in my living room, the same room where Daniel had once accused me of planning his downfall. I felt no triumph, just closure. I filed for divorce the next week, quietly, cleanly. Daniel didn't contest it. Perhaps that was his final act of decency. At the final hearing, the judge glanced at our file and said almost casually, "You've been very patient." Yes, I replied, I have. As I left the courthouse, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't thinking about Judith, or Richard, or Stephen, not even Daniel. I was thinking about myself, about the woman who had sat at that dinner table months ago, nodding politely as her future was erased. She had survived, she had adapted, she had learned, and now she was free. Freedom is quieter than people imagine. There was no dramatic relief, no sudden rush of joy after the divorce papers were signed and the settlement finalized. What came instead was space, emotional silence where tension used to live, mornings without bracing myself, evenings without rehearsing conversations that would never happen. I hadn't realized how loud my life had been until it wasn't. Daniel moved out completely within 2 weeks. He left the keys on the counter just like that. No note, no apology, no goodbye. I stood in the kitchen afterward, turning the keys over in my hand, feeling the finality of it settle in my bones. 5 years reduced to a small piece of metal and an empty closet. The first real test of my new position came sooner than expected. As trustee, I was required to review a proposal Stephen had submitted regarding expansion of one of the manufacturing contracts. On paper, it looked ambitious, promising. In reality, it was reckless, high-risk, poorly insulated, designed to move money quickly rather than sustainably. The kind of plan that benefited someone who wanted to extract value fast and move on. In the past, this decision would have been made without me. Now it crossed my desk. I scheduled a formal review meeting. Stephen arrived late, irritated, his confidence brittle. Judith attended as an observer, her presence stiff and disapproving. Richard sat quietly watching measuring. I asked questions. Calm ones, specific ones. Stephen bristled. Judith interrupted. Richard tried to redirect. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't accuse, I simply followed the data. At the end, I declined the proposal. The silence that followed was thick. You don't have the experience to make that call, Stephen snapped. I have the authority, I replied, and the responsibility. Judith leaned forward. You're enjoying this. No, I said, I'm doing my job. That was the moment they understood something fundamental. I wasn't acting out of spite. I wasn't improvising. I wasn't emotional. I was methodical. And that made me far more difficult to dislodge. Word traveled quickly. Within weeks, I was approached by external advisors who had previously dealt only with Richard. They were cautious at first, curious about my intentions. I made them clear. Stability, transparency, long-term value. No hidden maneuvers. No backroom deals. Some pushed back, others adapted. Judith stopped calling. Richard became polite in a way that felt unfamiliar. Stephen oscillated between hostility and forced charm. None of it mattered. The dynamic had shifted permanently. Outside the family, my own life began to expand in unexpected ways. I took a promotion I had previously avoided. I reconnected with friends I had drifted from. I traveled alone for the first time, discovering that solitude felt less like loneliness and more like ownership. One evening, while unpacking boxes I had ignored for years, I found an old journal. Early entries from my marriage, pages filled with optimism, with plans, with compromises I had framed as love. I read them slowly without judgment. That woman had done the best she could with what she knew. I closed the journal and placed it back in the box. Some chapters don't need to be reread to be honored. A letter arrived a month later, from Judith, handwritten, brief. She acknowledged that things had changed, that she disagreed with many decisions but accepted the outcome. There was no apology. There didn't need to be. Acceptance was enough. I realized then that revenge, real revenge, rarely looks like destruction. It looks like permanence, like outlasting, like building something that doesn't collapse when the people who tried to control you lose interest. They had told me I would get nothing from their family, and in a way they were right. I didn't get what they thought mattered. I didn't get blind inheritance or unearned loyalty. I got autonomy, and that I was learning was worth far more. Time has a way of stripping stories down to their truth. Without the noise of conflict, without the constant defense of my own existence, I began to see the past more clearly. Not as a series of betrayals alone, but as lessons I had been slow to learn. The most important one was this. People show you who they are long before they tell you what they intend to do. I had simply chosen not to listen. A year passed, quietly, deliberately. The legal dust settled. The business stabilized under stricter oversight. Profits slowed at first, then leveled out healthier, more sustainable. The advisors who had resisted me either adapted or left. New ones came in chosen for competence rather than loyalty to a name. I didn't seek their approval. I demanded their professionalism. Judith and Richard aged noticeably during that year. Stress will do that to people who are used to control. They attended required meetings, spoke when necessary, withheld when they could. We existed in a careful truce. Stephen, on the other hand, struggled. Without unchecked access, his impulsiveness had nowhere to hide. Projects stalled, opportunities dried up. For the first time, consequences followed him. I felt no satisfaction watching that unfold, just inevitability. Daniel reached out once, a single email. He said he hoped I was well, that he was trying to understand his part in everything, that he wished he had been braver. I read it twice, then archived it. Growth doesn't always require response. One afternoon, I visited Margaret's grave alone. The headstone was simple, just as she had been. I told her about the changes, about the business, about my life, about how often I thought of her when I made decisions that required backbone instead of permission. The wind moved softly through the trees. I felt grounded there in a way I hadn't expected. Later that week, a younger colleague asked me for advice. She was engaged, preparing to marry into a family that made her uneasy. She asked how I had known when to fight and when to leave. I told her the truth. I didn't know at first. I learned when they tried to make me smaller. She nodded, thoughtful. I hoped she listened. At home, I hosted a small dinner. Friends, chosen family, people who had seen me through the worst without asking me to perform gratitude in exchange. The table was modest, the food simple, the conversation real. As I looked around, I realized how different this felt from that first dinner, the one that had started everything. No hierarchy, no silent tests, no conditional belonging. I raised my glass. To clarity, I said. They echoed it, smiling. Later that night alone, I reflected on the journey, on how revenge had never been my goal, even when anger burned hottest. What I had wanted was dignity, a refusal to be erased, a chance to stand in my own life without apology. They had tried to write me out, to define my worth by what they controlled. Instead, they had given me the clearest gift of all. The moment I stopped seeking their approval was the moment my life truly began. Tomorrow there would be more meetings, more decisions, more responsibilities. But tonight, there was peace, earned, hard-won, unapologetic, and that I knew now was the truest inheritance of all. The story people expected ended months ago, with a courtroom decision, with a settlement, with a divorce decree signed and filed. That is how these things are usually framed. Beginning conflict resolution. But real life is rarely that neat. The truth is, the final chapter didn't arrive with noise. It arrived quietly in the moments when I realized I no longer measured my worth against anyone else's approval. On the anniversary of that dinner, the one where Judith and Richard told me I would get nothing from their family, I cooked for myself. Not to commemorate them, to acknowledge the woman I had been sitting at that table, hands folded, heart racing, still believing that patience would earn her safety. I set a single place, simple food, no candles, no performance, just nourishment. I thought about what I had lost, a marriage that was never truly equal, a family that offered conditional belonging, years spent shrinking myself to avoid discomfort. And then I thought about what I had gained: clarity, authority over my own life, the confidence to sit in silence without feeling diminished by it. The business continued to run, smoothly, predictably. The chaos that had once driven it was gone. Decisions were slower now, but stronger. I had learned something essential through all of this. Power doesn't need to announce itself. It only needs to be consistent. Judith stopped attending meetings altogether. Richard spoke rarely. Stephen eventually left to pursue something vague and undefined, chasing the kind of freedom that comes from never having to finish what you start. I wish them no harm. I wish them accountability. There is a difference. Occasionally, someone would ask me how it felt. The inheritance, the position, the aftermath. They expected satisfaction, or bitterness, or triumph. I told them the truth. It felt like standing upright after years of leaning. It felt normal in a way that once seemed impossible. I moved houses, not because I had to, but because I wanted a space that didn't echo with old versions of myself. I chose a place with light and quiet and a small study where I could think without interruption. On the first night there, I slept deeply, without dreaming. I kept one thing from my marriage, not an object, but a habit. I no longer ignore discomfort. I no longer explain it away. When something feels wrong, I listen. That lesson alone was worth everything it cost me to learn it. One afternoon, I received a message from a woman I didn't know. She said she had heard my story through someone who knew someone. She said she was sitting at a family table where she felt invisible. She asked how I found the courage to stop accepting less. I thought about it before replying. Then I wrote back. I didn't find courage, I found clarity. Courage followed. That is the part people misunderstand about revenge stories. They think revenge is the point. It isn't. The point is reclamation, taking back your voice, your agency, your future. Revenge is just the language people use when they don't yet have better words. They told me I would get nothing from their family. They were right in the narrow way they understood the world. I didn't get their money freely given. I didn't get their blessing. I didn't get to remain comfortable inside a lie. I got something better. I got the truth. I got to choose myself. I got to build a life that doesn't require anyone's permission to exist. And if you're listening to this, if you've ever sat quietly while someone decided your value for you, remember this. The moment they draw a line to keep you out is often the moment you stop needing to be inside at all. If this story resonated with you, if you saw yourself in any part of it, take a moment. Like the video. Share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to the channel for more stories about truth, accountability, and what happens when the tables finally turn. Because some stories aren't told to entertain. They're told to remind you that your life is still yours to claim.